So I'd like to welcome you to tonight's class on chess openings. We're going through the Benoni this week and next week. We're covering the old-fashioned Czech Benoni tonight. So the Benoni is a defense against d4, and black's first move is c5. And white, you'll see in the notes there that this concedes white a space advantage right off the bat. He moves his pawn up, so his pawn's on the fifth row, and it opens up more squares for white because his pawns are further advanced than black. Now, black gets a few things in return for that concession. He gets a tight center pawn. White doesn't command the whole center with pawns side by side because he'll have a pawn chain. So it keeps the position blocked. There's no mating attacks or anything that black has to worry about. It's very solid in the opening, and it's a maneuvering game. So you'll see there's no brilliant kingside attacks right away. So black plays d6 here. White plays c4. White needs to get both his pawns to support the d5 pawn in this opening. So now we're at the point where they have the old way of playing, which we're going to go through tonight, e5. It's called the Czech Benoni. And this was played in Russia Cup 2010. November 12th, between Khairullin and Zvjaginsev. Please excuse my very bad Russian pronunciation. So, I wanted to start with this because the old-fashioned line's not played much, and it's really only one line. It's easy to learn. The modern Benoni, which is favored by more modern players, is e6, and the idea is to take the center pawn. It opens up the e file. Black plays g6 and puts his bishop on the open black diagonal and gets strong counterplay. That's called the modern Benoni. I'll cover that next week. Got a handout for you over on that table, so make sure you grab one before you leave. Okay, so e5. And you can see white just blocks the... So the characteristic of this opening, see how the center's blocked, all the 6 pawns, 3 for white and black, they block each other. That means there's not going to be any central attacks by bishops on d3 to the king side that's blocked by his own pawns, and black's bishop on f8 is hemmed in by the black pawns. He just goes to e7. The knight comes out. This is just normal development where once the pawns are up, you develop piece after piece till you get your army from the first rank out, and then you start doing something to move up the board. Try to take as many squares from your opponent as you can. Okay, so the knight's pinned. White develops this knight over because he wants to give the queen freedom of movement, and if bishop takes knight, he wants to take back with the knight. Black brought his knight up to f6, and white puts his bishop where it protects the 2 white pawns in the center. Now, the bishop on d3 has an added purpose. In this pawn structure, eventually, black will try to move that f7 pawn to f5 to trade off the e4 pawn. And the bishop on d3 works through the e4 pawn onto the f5 square, and the pawn can take it, and then the bishop could trade whatever piece takes back, or the bishop would get an open line. The other break, they call these pawn breaks. It's where the black can move pawns to attack white, or where white could move his pawns to attack the black pawns. So the other black pawn break would be if he moved his b7 pawn to b5 and took out the c4 pawn. He may try to do that. He'll have to play a6 first, and then b5. He probably have to move his rook over, and he might have to move his knight to c7. Now white's pawn breaks. The one he tries for, his f2 pawn is blocked by his knight, as is black's f7. Potentially, he could move the f2 pawn to f4 and open up, after he castles, that would open up the rook file with the rook on f1. And the other one is to move this pawn up here and take out that pawn. He could open it and then put a rook here. He'd have an open line for his rook. So that's what you'll see both players doing. Once they get castled and everything, they'll work to open up lines for their rooks with these pawn moves. Black castles, white castles. Now if you look at the notation, it's got the white's move in the black box, and it's got the plus over equal sign. That's the chess notation in computers and in books for a slight advantage for white. Now the decimal note, 0.51, it's a positive number. That goes inside and quantifies white's advantage. And it's based on the fact that 1.00, the value 1, is assigned to a pawn. So when you see 0.51, it means white has the advantage of half a pawn. Now, we're only on move 8. It's common for white to have an advantage of 0.3 of a pawn to half a pawn in the opening due to the first move advantage. And if black plays correctly, he should be able to diminish that 0.5. If black makes these are minor mistakes. If he makes minor mistakes, that 0.5 will start to creep up. Now, black's not in danger of losing until that gets near one pawn. In Grandmaster chess, if a Grandmaster's one pawn ahead, he usually wins the game. But the computer that does this annotation doesn't consider it a one game till it gets up to about 1.35, which would be 1 1/3 pawns. But suffice it to say, once you get near one pawn up, the Grandmaster who has that one point advantage is near a win, a big advantage.
You know, like what percentage?
Oh, I'd be guessing somewhere around 80. When it gets up, 80, 85. Really, a Grandmaster who's defending would not want to get in a position where he's down by one whole pawn. That doesn't mean he's down a pawn. It just means his position is evaluated as equivalent of being down a pawn. So all this means is white has a positional advantage because there's no material advantage. All right. Now, black plays knight to a6. And remember, I told you he might come here, and then play for b5. So that's what his plan is. See that the symbol next to knight to a6? It's a question mark, exclamation mark. That means it's a dubious move. It's not a real bad move, but it's not his best move. And look how the evaluation jumped to 0.66. So it went up 0.15 of a pawn, which is 1/6 of a pawn. So now had it jumped up another half pawn, that would have been a question mark, a bad move. It's merely a dubious move, which means black didn't find the best move. Okay, anyway, white develops his rook to e1. Even though it's blocked by the pawn, the rook is better on e1 where it supports the e4 pawn. On f1, it can't move anywhere. It's behind a pawn on f2. So that improves the rook. Black continues with his plan of playing for b5. Now, white could stop b5 by playing a4. But if white moved his pawn here, it would leave a hole in his pawn position. See, there'd be a pawn here and a pawn here and a pawn here. That knight could move here and go into this hole, and the knight would be on the 5th row attacking the bishop and harassing white. So a4 is what you would call double-edged. It does prevent b5, but it gives the knight a good square. White's not going to do that. What white does, he plays a3. Now, who could tell me in the audience what white's next move would be if we gave white an extra move?
Probably b4.
That's right. So sometimes the grandmaster moves are quite obvious. He does a3. He wants to get b4 in before black gets b5 in. And black can't play it right away because he'd lose a pawn. Okay, so this is an interesting point here. White still has a slight advantage. The question is, what is black's best move? Now, black chooses to retreat his knight. Why do you think black retreated his knight there? Anybody have an idea?
Black has to play b5 at all costs, or else he's going to be worse. So
But how does the knight to d7 help that?
is he going to try to push his f-pawn?
I think so.
Okay.
I think what he's doing is switching between, both are valid ideas for black. It looks like he's opting to play one or the other. Now here's what the computer says he should have done. The computer thinks that he should have played a5, giving up the b5 break, but preventing white's b4. See, that would allow black to defend his queen side better. Because when white plays here, black will take, and that rook will be here, and this white rook will be here, and he would have custody of the A file, and that would give him counter chances and a better defense on the queen side. So the computer says that's what he should have done. But he didn't do that. He wants to play for the other break now, you see. Now, in chess, you need to have a plan, but you shouldn't have two plans. So black shouldn't be trying for both breaks. He should have concentrated. Well, after he played a5, then he could do the knight back and play for f4 if he wants to. So maybe the knight to d7 isn't such a bad idea, but he should have played the a5 move first. Okay. Anyway, white plays h3. The knight blocks the bishop retreat. So now it's a good time to make the bishop take the knight or retreat to the h5 where he can't get back to the queen side. And he's blocked by the white pawns if he goes to h5. He didn't want to give up the bishop for a knight. That's a concession. Most grandmasters prefer bishops over knights, even though they're valued at 3 pawns each.
It's so closed.
It's closed, and that's supposed to favor knights. He could have played bishop takes knight, but he chose to retreat it. Now white moves his rook to b1. Obviously now he wants to get the rook on b1 to support b4, and then he can take on c5 and open the rook file and threaten the pawn on b7. Black makes a dubious move now. Remember I told you that bishop was a bad bishop because it was blocked by the black pawns. So black knows that, and he moves it to g5. That knight is pinned, so the knight can't take it right away, the knight on f3, because it's pinned to the queen. So black decides to trade off his black scored bishop for either the knight. He would, if this knight moved, he'd love to trade it for that bishop. Even though this hasn't moved, the problem with this old-fashioned Czech Benoni is that bishop is blocked by his pawns on black squares. That's why he moved the bishop to g5, but the computer says it's a dubious move. And look, it crept up to 0.73 now. It went up 0.2, 1/5 of a pawn. You get enough of these dubious moves and you're going to be a pawn down pretty soon. Anyway, white takes advantage of it and plays g4. See, he's not going to trade off his bishop. He's going to trade a knight for the bishop. So he gets the knight for the bishop. Black's queen comes up, and white chases it away right away with the knight, and the queen retreats. Now, white made a reasonable and a good move, but he missed the best move. White carried out his plan of b4. Now look what happened to the valuation. It went from 0.73 down to 0.51. I could have called b4 dubious, but what really happened was he missed his best move. Anybody have an idea what the best move is for white? It's right there in the note. It's what he should have done is done bishop to g5. See, attacking the queen. Now black has several options that aren't good. The first option would be to move the knight to f6, which would pin the knight to the queen. Then that knight wouldn't do any good, and he would never get his f5 pawn break in, would he? Remember, he retreated the knight so he could play f5. The other thing he could do, he could retreat the queen. He'd go to e8. On e8, the queen is blocked on the white diagonals by the pawn and the knight, and you don't want your queen on the first row anyway. The only other option is to block the bishop, which is probably the best option, f6, and it drives, the bishop would go, where would the bishop go if f6 was played?
Bishop h4.
Where?
h4.
No. See, the problem with going to h4, see those pawns from e5, f6, g7? That bishop on h4 can never get through those pawns. If he goes to g3, he hits the e5 pawn, the black pawn. If he stays at h4, he's hitting the f6 pawn. If he goes to e3, he's hitting this pawn. The white square for the bishop is here, where it supports this pawn advance, doesn't get in the way of the rook, and maybe once some pawns trade off, the bishop can come here or here, and then go this way. And the bishop here helps defend anything happening over here. So the correct retreat is bishop to d2. The computer says knight to f6, and then see, he played b4, but he should have played the bishop up first. That black moved the knight, pinned the knight. That makes this stronger because the knight's further away from the action. He'd play h6. Now the bishop takes the knight, and the queen takes here. If he takes pawn back, he loses that pawn, and the rook attacks the knight. So now we're a real pawn up. His best move is to give up a pawn, knight to a6, pawn takes. He can take that pawn back with the queen, and then he blocks this pawn, attacking the bishop. It's not an aggressive move. He moved here to block the white's extra pawn, and there's no pawn to chase it away. This is a great square for the knight, and the knight defends this pawn, so this rook can't take the pawn. Then the queen takes the pawn, and black can defend this position even though he's a pawn down. White would just move up here. Having moved his pawns here and here, this knight needs to be reinforced so the queen can move. The queen, with that queen on the knight, now the king protects it so the queen can move somewhere. And the king protects the h3 pawn. And depending on what happens, a rook could slide over to the king side on the first row and help defend the king side, or even he could start a pawn attack in the future on the king side. Now look at how the computer evaluates it. 0.81. See, this is a big advantage. This is what white should have done. Now all white did in this position, not this position, right here, he played b4 one move too early. And it went down 0.51. Had he played the bishop move and then the knight pin and then played b4, he ends up with a 0.81 advantage. So it's these minor little things that have a big impact. Okay, so a 0.51, we're back to a half pawn advantage. That's like your first move advantage. Black's in no real danger of losing, but he has to continue to defend and try to reduce white's small advantage. Black plays b6. This move is commonly played in Benonis to shore up this pawn. Pawn takes, you can take back with this pawn or maybe this pawn, and then you can move a knight and put a knight here and block the pawn. And if you keep these pawns here, it keeps the rook out. But it's the wrong idea. See, this is defensive. Black is just defending. Black can be a little more active than just pure defensive. The computer says that maybe he should have taken here, and white takes back. Now, see how this pawn guards this square so the knight can't come up here and block this pawn? And white wants to play this pawn up. He can't do it right away. He'll put the bishop here, and then he'll bring the queen here and maybe the rook here, and then he can push here and attack this pawn. So black plays a good move. He attacks the pawn here so there's not two pawns side by side, and this pawn can never go here. White takes. You take with the rook. Now the rook has an open file, and the knight can hop in here with a good square. He does lose a pawn. The knight hops up, chases the rook back, and then this rook comes down here and pins the bishop, and it's going to cost white some moves to unwind the position. But white is a solid pawn up, and the computer says this would be 0.72 advantage. Anyway, b6. Now, white misses the second opportunity to play bishop to g5 and attack the queen. The same reason holds. The queen either retreats to e8, moves the knight to a pin, or f6, and then he's weakened his pawn structure. And then you could go not to e3, the bishop belongs on d2. So the computer says bishop to e3, look at the evaluation. It went from 0.72 to 0.40, almost equality now. 0.72 was almost a pawn up. Now we're down to just a little more than a third of a pawn. So the computer doesn't like that move. It says he should have done this, and I give it an exclamation mark, which means good move. f6. Then the bishop goes to d2, takes. And now here's not such a good move because you take, and he can't take with the rook because the bishop's on it. He'd take with the pawn, and the rook can come down here and attack this knight. White has a big advantage, and the best move is he moves that rook over there to defend the pawns, and he wants to trade rooks when white advances his pawns. And this would be back to a 0.79. That would maintain our almost a pawn advantage, less a fifth. So it's a 4/5 of a pawn advantage. So anyway, bishop to e3 was not the right square. He should have attacked the queen. And if he didn't want to attack the queen, he should have gone to d2. Rook over. Knight came back. That knight maybe coming up here, then he can take here, and if the knight takes, he can take back. Something like that. Now black makes a big mistake. He voluntarily plays f6. There was no need to play f6. And it blocks the queen. The queen has a diagonal up toward h5 where it could attack the h3 pawn. Maybe play h5 attacking the g4 pawn. By playing f6, he shut his queen out. He reduced his future move, so that's why it's a bad move. And look over there, the computer says, now plus over minus, that's a big advantage. We're up to 0.94 of a pawn. Well, white plays his rook up. You'll notice that black, all his pieces, forget the pawns, all his pieces are on 2 rows. This is called a big space advantage for white. This is why they don't play the old-fashioned Benoni. You don't want to be cramped like this. You want to have your pieces moving into enemy territory. You don't want to be playing on your last 2 rows. So black's in real trouble. He drops the knight here. Going to come up here and looks like. And black doesn't have a lot of good moves, so he puts the knight over there. Knight comes up here. He tries g5. He doesn't want white to get f4 or h4 ideas, so he's trying to block the position and play for a draw by blocking all the pawns. White opens up that file. See, when the knight moved, had the knight stayed here, white wouldn't do pawn takes because the knight could take back, blocking the pawn, and it would cost him a good bishop to get rid of the knight. So he wouldn't do pawn takes pawn. When he moved the knight to f8, now it allows pawn takes pawn, and either pawn takes back is not so good. He takes with the d pawn. That's the right way to take it. You don't want to open up this file for the rook by taking pawn takes. White plays up here. Now he's going to play the knight up here, and if that knight takes, he'll take with this pawn. Then that'll open up this file to this backward pawn, and he'll pile up rooks and queens and win that pawn. Black comes up. This was his idea with that knight maneuver. He wants to go here and attack this pawn and this bishop. Not a bad idea, but it wasn't the right idea in this particular game. Okay, so he didn't do the knight move. He's attacking the pawns. If pawn takes pawn, he can't defend that pawn. The queen can't come up here, but the queen could come over here and get the pawn back. And then that rook could come here and he'd have 2 rooks on the open file. He brings his queen up. There's a rule in chess that you need to block. This is a passed pawn. They need to be blocked. But do you block passed pawns with your most valuable piece? No. Chess theory says one of the knights belongs here. Now, had he a black squared bishop, you block pawns with knights or bishops. They like knights best because the knight blocks the pawn and the knight can hop around the pawn and have a lot of good moves. A bishop is second choice. If there was a black bishop here, it would be blocked by his pawns. He wouldn't have any future moves. So the knight is the best blockader. The queen is the worst blockader. And the computer says that's a mistake, and now we're up to 1.33. We're up a pawn and a third. Pawns are still even, so this is a big positional advantage. And I got a little note that black had a better defense had he brought the rook over here just to hold the pawn, not blocked with the queen, and that's a 0.98. Still about a pawn advantage, but less than one and a third pawns. Okay, anyway, white brings his queen up, threatening to win this pawn. So black rushes his rook over. Now black is thinking he's threatening pawn takes pawn, the rook will be on the queen. And apparently white thought so too, because white moved the queen away from the rook where it protects the pawn. But that was not the right move. See how the valuation dropped 0.89 from 1.33? That's a 44, that's almost half a pawn drop. Still a big advantage. What the computer said he should have done, if pawn takes pawn, he can do queen takes rook and get two rooks for the queen, and the rook will be here attacking the bishop pinned to the king. You want your rook to penetrate to the back row. The right move was to move this rook here, and if pawn takes pawn, you win the rooks, and then this rook can take this pawn, and you threaten to win this pawn, and it would be a win. So let's go through what the computer says. Rook here. Black's best is to bring his knight up, attacking the bishop that's now unprotected, and the pawn. We don't take the knight. We want to keep our black square, our two bishops. We have a good move. We just retreat the bishop. See how it defends the pawn on h3. And the knight can't go anywhere because the bishop guards all the squares. And when things open up, that bishop can come out later on in the game. And the computer says this is a 1.43 advantage. Now, instead of knight to f4, had he done pawn takes pawn, see how it's a mistake? We get the two rooks, and the computer says that this is 4.66 pawn advantage. That's a massive winning advantage. So when white moved the queen here, he should have brought the rook here. When you have your queen and rook in an attacking position, don't be afraid to get two rooks for the queen. You bring in the other attacking rook, you really pile up, and black could not have defended his position. Anyway, he's still in a bad way. White's still 0.9 of a pawn advantage. He brings the knight up. Again, the bishop drops back. He tries to weaken white's pawns, but white can reinforce the pawn with f3. Bishop comes in. Black's not going to be able to break through in a timely fashion on the king side. White doubles up rooks. He's breaking through on the queen side for sure. Pawn takes. H-pawn takes. You got to keep your pawn chains intact. So, and the rule is to take toward the center. So H-pawn is the normal. Now there is an open H-file. But look, the rooks are over here and the queen's over here. They can't go over to the H-file to come down and try to checkmate the white king. Black panics and makes a bad move. He's in a lost position though. He sacrifices a bishop hoping we've all done this. You're under a lot of pressure. You're losing the game, so you do a sacrifice, hoping for a miracle attack. And if your opponent doesn't answer it properly, you might pull out a draw or even win if you're lucky. So that's what black tries. But he's playing one of the top players in the world who knows exactly how to defend. So this is an unsound sacrifice of a bishop. And look, it's, you don't see it, but it's 3.23 is the advantage for white after that. The somewhat better, but still losing, would have been rook to A8, and that's 1.5 pawn advantage. So white would win even with the better move. But black's dead lost now. Pawn takes. Queen comes over to pick up the pawn. Bishop defends the pawn. The only way to get that pawn is to give up that very strong knight on f4. But that brings the rook over where it helps defend the king side. Queen takes. Rook goes there. That e4 pawn's protected by the knight. Queen has to move. Now the white queen hurries back to come over to the king side, help defend. King up so the rook can come over. Knight comes back to help defend. Now if the rook came over and the queen got down here, the king just moves up here and these two protect. So that doesn't win for black. Anyway, he tries it, but white stops it with this nice move. Knight to g3, covering the h1 square. And the knight is aiming for the f5 square, and it defends the e4 pawn, and there's absolutely nothing black can do. Makes a few more moves. Now the queen comes over, and that pawn on f6 is pinned to the king, and white threatens bishop takes pawn. Black was probably in time trouble, but he was lost anyway. Losing that pawn with queen takes pawn check to follow was more than enough, so black resigned. The opening they played pretty well, but black kind of caved in at later on in the game. All right, well, that'll cover it for tonight. Thanks for coming.